The footage was never meant to be seen. Inside Attica prison in 1971, men shouted for justice, but what they got was silence, smoke, and gunfire. When the state took back the yard, 43 people were dead. Officials said it was a riot. Survivors called it murder. This is the story they tried to erase. The one buried under official statements, sealed autopsies, and burned evidence. If you care about truth, stay till the end. Like, share, and subscribe. What you're about to hear is not history, it's confession. They said Attica was just another prison. A place for men who broke the law, to sit, think, and pay. But the truth was, Attica in 1971 wasn't a prison. It was pressure contained in concrete. It was a human boiler, and no one noticed the heat rising until it finally exploded. Every wall there whispered the same word, control. 4,000 men. Mostly black and Latino inmates, guarded by mostly white officers from small upstate towns. Two worlds colliding inside the same locked space. The food was rotten, the water came out brown, and the pay for prison labor was 20 cents a day. For years, the men wrote letters. Pleas to the governor, to the Department of Corrections, to anyone who might care. But every letter came back stamped the same way, received. Reviewed. Dismissed. In D Block, where the noise never really stopped, a man named Elliot Red Johnson kept a notebook hidden under his mattress. In it were names, dates, and details, small acts of cruelty that the guards called discipline. One entry read. Guard Spicer made me crawl through the hallway. Said it was exercise. Said I should thank him for the privilege. Red wasn't a leader. He was tired, quiet, and always watching. But when he spoke, the others listened. Every morning began with the same ritual, count time, followed by orders barked through megaphones. Men shuffled into the yard, some dragging their feet because they didn't have laces. Laces were banned after too many tried to hang themselves. The guards wore expressions like masks. No empathy, no recognition. Just uniform faces under blue caps, holding batons they didn't need to be told how to use. By late August, something began to change. You could feel it in the air. There was talk, low whispers in the mess hall, coded messages through the plumbing system. The inmates had formed a list. Not a threat. A demand. 14 points. Each one simple. Human. Better food. Religious freedom. The right to read more than one book a week. Medical care that didn't involve a guard deciding whether your pain was real. One demand stood out: we are men. We are not beasts. That sentence would echo for decades. When word reached the administration, Warden Vincent Mancusi dismissed it outright. We don't negotiate with criminals, he told his staff. The guards cheered. The inmates took note. In the yard, Red sat with a man named Carlos Vega, a former Vietnam veteran serving time for robbery. Carlos had seen war, and to him, Attica felt familiar. You put too many desperate men in one cage, he told Red. Sooner or later they stop asking. They start taking. The spark came on the morning of September 9th. It began with a routine transfer. A few inmates moved to disciplinary housing. But one guard, nervous and heavy-handed, pushed too far. He struck an inmate named Sam Melville in the face. Sam fell, hit the concrete, and didn't get up right away. The noise that followed wasn't shouting, it was something deeper. Like a sound that had been building for years and finally tore through the walls. The men rushed forward. Keys were taken. Gates forced open. Within minutes, the entire D block erupted. The guards who survived the first wave were dragged inside cells, not beaten, not yet. The inmates barricaded doors with beds, took over the yard, and suddenly, the impossible had happened. Attica was theirs. But even in chaos, there was order. Men like Red and Carlos took charge, keeping others from turning it into slaughter. They knew the eyes of the world were about to turn toward them, and if they wanted to be heard, they had to be seen as men, not animals. They brought the hostages, over 40 correctional officers, into the yard, treating their wounds, giving them food. It was a strange sight, inmates guarding the guards, while the state surrounded the walls with rifles and megaphones. Governor Nelson Rockefeller refused to come. "We will not yield to anarchy," he said from Albany. But inside Attica, the men stood under makeshift banners that read "Brothers Unite." Journalists were finally allowed in. Cameras rolled. The prisoners stood shoulder to shoulder, Muslims, Panthers, white radicals, all speaking with one voice. Their spokesman, a man named L.D. Barkley, raised a microphone wrapped in wire and shouted, "We are men. We are not beasts, and we do not intend to be beaten or driven as such." The crowd roared. For a moment, you could almost believe something might change. But outside the fence, the state was preparing for war. Helicopters hovered low. Snipers took positions on rooftops. The hostages begged the negotiators to stay calm. The inmates believed time was on their side. But time, as it turned out, was the enemy. For 4 days, the yard became its own world. There were medical tents, makeshift kitchens, and prayer circles. Men who once hated each other now shared cigarettes and stories. Carlos wrote a letter to his wife through a smuggled notepad. "If I don't make it out, know that I died standing like a man, not crawling." On the 5th day, a state trooper dropped a note into the yard from a helicopter. It read, "You have 1 hour to surrender." When no one moved, the choppers came back, this time carrying canisters of gas. Thick white smoke rolled through the yard. Panic. Screams. Men clutching their faces. And then, gunfire. In the first few seconds, no one understood what was happening. The state had opened fire, not on a single cell block, but on the entire prison yard. The hostages, still held by the inmates, were caught in the crossfire. In minutes, 43 people were dead. 39 of them killed by police bullets. But that wasn't what the state said. The official report read, "Inmates executed hostages before being subdued." And just like that, the truth was buried. When the smoke cleared, Red was found alive under a pile of bodies. He told investigators he heard the guards cheering as they walked through the yard afterward. "They said we got what we deserved," he whispered. The riot was over, but the story had just begun. When the shooting stopped, the silence was worse than the gunfire. You could hear boots on gravel, the click of spent shells underfoot, men crying in a haze of gas that burned the skin raw. Reporters were ordered out. The cameras were seized. And somewhere behind those iron gates, the version of events that would make the evening news was already being written. Red lay half buried beneath bodies in the yard, the taste of blood and chemicals in his mouth. He was alive because 2 corpses had fallen across him when the bullets came down. When guards dragged him out, he didn't fight, he couldn't. They stripped him naked, lined him up with others, and made them crawl through puddles of their own blood. Someone was laughing. Someone else took pictures that never made it into any archive. By dusk, Attica was back under state control, but what remained of order was theater. The wounded were denied treatment unless they confessed. Those who begged were beaten for lying. Doctors later said they were told to write knife wounds instead of gunshot wounds. The word massacre was forbidden. At 9 p.m., Governor Rockefeller appeared on television. His voice was calm, confident. He called the retaking necessary to restore law and order. He praised the bravery of his troopers and expressed sorrow for the lives lost due to inmate brutality. In the control room, an aide handed him a sheet of paper listing the dead. Next to each name, someone had scribbled a note, hostage, inmate, or simply unknown. He folded it and walked away. Outside, families waited behind barricades for news. A woman named Angela Barkley, sister of the inmate spokesman, clutched a photo of her brother. When officials finally spoke, they said he'd been executed by other prisoners. Weeks later, the autopsy revealed he'd been shot in the back by a .30 caliber round, the same ammunition used by state police. Inside Attica, investigators from the state began their rounds. They weren't looking for truth, they were looking for culprits. They chose a handful of survivors, mostly the ones who could barely speak English or had visible scars. Red was among them. During interrogation, a lieutenant told him, "Sign this and you'll live." He never read what it said. It was a confession. In the months that followed, the official story solidified like concrete. Newspapers printed government statements without question. The governor's office released photographs showing hostages with throats slit, images later proven to be altered. But the lie had legs. It ran across the country before anyone could stop it. Then came the whistleblower. Dr. John Monahan, a young medical examiner assigned to Attica, refused to falsify reports. He leaked copies of the autopsies to a local journalist in Buffalo. Every single hostage, the reports showed, had died from police gunfire. None were executed. The leak made front-page news for a single day before state officials discredited him as emotionally unstable. Monahan lost his job. A month later, his car was found submerged in the Hudson River. Accident, they said. The surviving inmates were charged with murder. 42 of them. The state called it justice, the world called it vengeance. Years of trials followed, draining what little hope remained. Lawyers volunteered from New York City, civil rights groups rallied, but each case met the same fate: dismissed evidence, missing tapes, juries stacked with correctional officers' relatives. Out of hundreds of hours of recorded negotiations, only fragments survived. One of them captured a voice pleading through a megaphone, "We have no guns. There are hostages here." Then static, then screams. Meanwhile, the prison system doubled down. Budgets increased. Walls grew taller. Other wardens learned a lesson: never let the cameras in again. 10 years later, a civil lawsuit forced open a few cracks. Families of the dead sued New York State for wrongful death. The depositions revealed the orders came from the top: take back the prison by any means necessary. When asked if he regretted it, a former trooper said, "I regret we didn't finish the job." He smiled on record. Red testified via video from another prison. He was older now, softer around the edges, but his voice carried the same quiet fire. He told the courtroom, they called it a riot. It was a cry for dignity. They answered with bullets. The jury wept. The state settled for $12 million, money split among dozens of families after lawyers took their share. No officer was ever charged. But the truth has a way of surviving. Boxes of photos appeared in 1991, unmarked, water-stained. Inside, images of the yard after the shooting. Bodies stacked like cordwood. Troopers posing with rifles. In one frame, you could see Red, face down but breathing, a thin trail of smoke rising from the ground beside him. Those photos reignited the story. Documentaries followed, investigations reopened, and for a brief moment, America looked again at what it tried to forget. Yet even 50 years later, the official record still reads riot. No acknowledgement, no apology. The men who pulled the triggers lived long lives, some retiring with honors. The survivors carried their nightmares in silence. In an interview recorded in 2011, Red said quietly, "They killed us once with bullets and again with silence." Then he looked into the camera and added, "But silence doesn't last forever. Time doesn't move in prisons, it decays." By the time the country started saying the word Attica again, most of the men who had lived through it were either dead or ghosts inside their own bodies. Yet something in the air had changed. The uprising that was supposed to vanish had begun to haunt the nation's conscience. In the 1980s, new inmates arrived at Attica who had only heard fragments, rumors about a rebellion drowned in smoke and blood. To them, the names Red Johnson, L.D. Barkley, and Carlos Vega were legends, whispered like saints of a lost cause. A few guards still working there called those days the bad week. They never mentioned the gas, or the bodies, or how the walls had to be scrubbed twice because the stains kept reappearing when it rained. Red had been transferred out long before then, to a minimum security facility upstate. He worked in the laundry, quiet, almost invisible. Some nights he would sit by the barred window and listen to the hum of fluorescent lights, wondering if anyone outside still cared. He kept the notebook he'd started before the riot, pages swollen from years of sweat and time. On the last page he wrote, "They erased the proof, not the memory." That memory spread. Filmmakers found scraps of unreleased footage, reels marked restricted. They showed brief, jittery scenes, the yard covered in smoke, a voice shouting through a bullhorn, the flicker of muzzle flashes. Activists screened it on college campuses, projecting it onto brick walls as students stood in silence. Every frame felt like a wound reopening. By the 1990s, the uprising had become more than a tragedy, it was a symbol. Protesters carried signs reading "Remember Attica" during marches for prison reform, police accountability, racial justice. Every generation found its own reflection in that yard. But the system that produced it, overcrowding, dehumanization, the hunger for control, was still intact. The same design, just new paint. In one rare interview before his death, Carlos Vega, released after 20 years, said, "They think the riot ended that week. It never ended. It just moved to other prisons, other cities. Every time someone dies in custody and they call it natural causes, that's Attica again." When the state finally declassified the investigation files in 2016, journalists discovered whole boxes missing. Audio reels erased. Photographs labeled "lost in transport." Yet among the surviving papers was a single memo from a senior official. It read, "Contain the narrative. The nation cannot see weakness." Contain the narrative, those words became the true story of Attica. For decades, documentaries came and went. Politicians promised reforms and built newer prisons instead. The name Attica turned into shorthand for rebellion, invoked in movies, music, and protests. But the real voices, the ones from inside, were fading. Most of the survivors died before ever seeing acknowledgement. Red passed away in 2019, his body found in a small apartment filled with letters he'd written to newspapers that never replied. One envelope was addressed simply, "To anyone who still believes the truth matters." At his funeral, a former guard quietly attended in plain clothes. He stood in the back, head bowed. When asked later why he came, he said, "Because I remember the sound." Once you hear a man shout that he's a human being before he dies, you don't forget it. The modern world scrolls fast, always hungry for the next headline, the next outrage. But Attica refuses to fade. It surfaces every time a cell phone video captures brutality, every time a warden says necessary force, every time the system insists on order over humanity. The past keeps repeating, whispering through bars and bulletproof glass. And somewhere, maybe in some archive basement, there's still a missing reel of film, labeled Attica, Day 5, waiting to be found. Maybe it will never surface. Maybe it doesn't have to. Because the story survives in memory, in defiance, in the voices that keep saying, "We are men. We are not beasts." Rain falls on the old prison yard now, washing over cracked concrete and rusted fences. The towers stand empty, their searchlights long gone, yet the place hums with ghosts. Listen closely, and you might hear the echo of that chant carried on the wind, "We are men." History records events. Memory records feelings. Attica was both, a wound carved into the American conscience, covered but never healed. The state built new walls, wrote new rules, replaced the name with numbers. But the truth doesn't stay buried forever. It seeps through, like water through stone. Imagine standing there at dawn, 50 years later. The fog clings low. Somewhere under your feet, the soil still remembers the blood. You can almost see the outlines, figures rising from the mist, not as martyrs, but as men who dared to speak when silence was safer. Men who believed that dignity was worth dying for. And maybe that's why the story matters now, more than ever. Because the walls keep changing, but the system doesn't. Because every generation needs to be reminded what happens when power fears humanity. Because somewhere, another Red, another Carlos, another L.D. Barkley is looking out through steel bars, whispering the same words to himself. Attica is not over. It lives in every question we're afraid to ask. Every report that's sealed, every voice dismissed. The riot they tried to erase became the truth they can never silence. Fade out. Low strings. Rain on metal. The sound of keys dropping onto the ground, and footsteps walking away.